There is a sound that a blacksmith knows, a sound that lives in the space between the hammer and the anvil, a sound that is not quite a ring and not quite a crack, but something in between, something that tells you whether the iron is holding or whether it is about to shatter. And if you have ever stood in a forge and listened to that sound, if you have ever felt it in your teeth and in the bones of your wrists, then you know. Something about Rand or Thor that the histories will never tell you, because the histories will tell you about the battles and the prophecies and the wars and the thrones, but they will not tell you about the sound, the terrible, patient, endless sound of a boy being hammered into a shape he never chose, over and over, blow after blow, until the shape is set, until the iron forgets it was ever anything else, until the boy forgets he was ever a boy at all. His name was Rand al'Thor, and before the world took him, before the pattern reached down into the quiet green hills of the two rivers and plucked him out like a thread from a tapestry, he was a shepherd, just a shepherd, a boy with calloused hands and a crooked smile and a father who smelled like pipe smoke and lanolin. And his biggest worry in the whole of his existence was whether the ewes would lamb before the first frost, and whether Tam would let him take the cart into Emond's field alone. And that was the life. That was the whole of it, small and golden and fragile as a soap bubble, and the universe looked at that small golden life and decided it was not enough, decided it was never going to be enough, decided that this particular boy, in this particular village, in this particular unremarkable corner of the world, was going to carry the weight of everything on his shoulders, whether he wanted to or not. And he did not want to. And I need you to hear that. I need you to hold on to that fact with both hands and not let go of it. Because everything that comes after, every battle, every throne, every terrible choice, and every night spent staring at the ceiling wondering if the voice in his skull belongs to him or to the dead man who lived 3,000 years ago, all of it, every single moment of it, happens to a boy who just wanted to stay home and watch the sheep and grow old in a village that didn't have a name worth remembering. And the pattern did not care. The pattern never cares. The pattern simply reaches down and takes what it needs and calls it destiny and expects you to be grateful. But this is not the story of a hero. And I need you to understand that before we go any further, because if you came here expecting the tale of a chosen one who rises and conquers and saves the world and rides into the sunset with a sword held high, you are going to be disappointed. You are going to be uncomfortable. You are going to sit in the dark and feel something pressing against your chest that you cannot name. Because Rand al'Thor's story is not a story about triumph. It is a story about cost, about what it takes to save the world when the saving requires you to become something that is no longer human, when the only way to protect everyone you love is to stop loving them, when the only way to win is to become the very thing you are fighting against, and then to find, at the very end, in the last possible moment before the fire goes out forever, a way to become human again. This is a story about a boy who was broken so many times that he forgot what being whole felt like, who was given so much power that the power ate him from the inside out, who heard the voice of a madman in his skull and could not tell where the madman ended. And he began, who looked into the eyes of every person who loved him and chose to push them away, because keeping them close meant they could be used against him, and who walked into the heart of the world's darkness, not with a sword but with a question, not with rage but with a grief so old and so vast that it had been waiting 3,000 years for someone to finally feel it. And I am not going to pretend it is easy to tell. I am not going to pretend that some parts of this story do not make me want to stop, to put the words down, to walk away and come back another day when the weight of it feels lighter, because it does not feel lighter. It never feels lighter. And the things he did, the things that were done to him, the things he did to himself because he believed there was no other way, those things sit in the telling like stones in a riverbed, and you cannot smooth them. You can only walk over them carefully, feeling each one press into the sole of your foot. From the first night the Trollocs came to the last wisp of pipe smoke rising into a sky that no longer needed saving. I will tell it because he deserves to be remembered, not as the dragon, not as the prophecy, not as the weapon, but as the boy. The stubborn, frightened, impossible boy who stood in the fire and let it burn him because he thought that was what was required, who became the sword because no one else would, who broke himself on the anvil of the world's need and called it duty and called it sacrifice and called it anything except what it was, which was a child screaming into the dark and getting no answer. So, pull up a chair, pour yourself something strong, and understand that this is not going to be comfortable. That there will be parts where you want to look away, where you want to argue, where you want to say, he should have done differently, been different, been kinder, been softer, been more. And you will be right. You will be absolutely right. But you will also be wrong. Because you were not there. You did not hear the voice in his skull. You did not feel the power eating your mind. Like acid eating glass, you did not have to choose between your sanity and the survival of the world. And he did. Every single day for 3 years, and he chose the world, and the world did not thank him, and he did not expect it to. This is the story of Rand al'Thor, the shepherd, the dragon, the madman, the saint, the boy, all of them, all at once. All in the same skin, the same skull, the same pair of hands that held a crook, and then held a sword, and then held the fate of every living soul on the face of the earth. The hammer is raised, the iron is in the fire, and the sound is about to begin. Before the fire, before the hammer, before the voice in the skull and the weight of the world and the long, terrible years of being something that was not a person but a function, a tool, a prophecy with legs, there was a boy on a hill with a crook in his hand and wool grease on his fingers and the smell of lanolin so deep in his skin that no amount of scrubbing could ever fully wash it out. And that boy was Rand al'Thor, and he was 17, and he was nobody, and he was exactly where he wanted to be, which was here, on this hill, above the village of Emond's field, watching the sheep drift across the green like clouds that had forgotten how to fly. With the wind in his hair and the sun on his face and the sound of the world being small and quiet and manageable, the sound of a world that did not need saving, that did not need him to be anything other than what he was, which was a shepherd, just a shepherd, a boy who knew every ewe in his father's flock by name and could tell you which ones were about to lamb and which ones had a limp and which ones had a particular stubbornness that reminded him, uncomfortably, of Tam. Tam al'Thor was his father, or so he believed, or so he had been told, or so the shape of his life had always suggested, because Tam was there, Tam had always been there. Tam was the steady hands on the plow and the pipe smoke in the kitchen and the quiet, solid, unshakable presence of a man who did not need to say much because his being was enough. And Rand had built his entire understanding of himself on the foundation of Tam, on the belief that he came from this man, that his bones were Tam's bones, that his stubbornness was Tam's stubbornness, that the slight crook in his smile was inherited, and that was the bedrock, that was the thing. Underneath everything else, and when it cracked, when it finally cracked, it would crack everything above it too. But that was later, that was not yet, and for now, Rand was just a boy on a hill with his father's sheep. And his father's silence, and the long golden afternoon stretching out in front of him like a road that went nowhere and didn't need to go anywhere because here was enough. Here was everything. And there was something else, something small, something he never spoke about because speaking about it would make it real, and making it real would mean he had to do something about it, and he did not want to do something about it. He wanted to pretend it wasn't there. The way you pretend a bruise isn't tender until someone presses it and you flinch and can no longer deny it. It was a feeling, not a thought, not a vision, just a feeling, a sense of not fitting, of being slightly too large for the shape of his life, the way a river is too large for its banks in the spring when the snow melt. Comes and the water rises and presses against the edges and wants to go over, wants to spill, wants to find a wider channel, and Rand felt that, felt it in the quiet hours, felt it when he stood on the hill and looked at the horizon and thought, not in words, not in anything so deliberate as thought, but in some deeper, wordless place. There is more than this. There is something past this, something that is not sheep and not hills and not the slow turning of the seasons, something that is waiting for me on the other side of the mountain. And I do not want to go find it. I do not want to know what it is, but it knows I am here, it knows my name, and one day it is going to come looking for me. And he was right, and he hated being right, and the day it came looking for him was a night in late winter when the snow was falling thick, and the village was quiet, and the world felt wrapped in cotton. muffled, distant, safe. And Rand was in bed, half asleep, in that warm, drowsy space between waking and dreaming where nothing is quite real and everything is soft, and then the world ended. Not literally, not yet. Not in the way it would end years later on the plains of Merilor with the sky spitting and the ground shaking and 2 million people screaming, but it ended in the way that matters more, in the way that ends a life not by stopping the heart, but by changing the shape of everything the heart beats for. And what ended it was a sound that did not belong, a sound that was not the wind and not the sheep, and not the creak of the farmhouse settling in the cold, but something wrong, something wet and heavy and purposeful. The sound of something large moving through snow that was not meant to be moved through. And Rand opened his eyes, and the window was red, not with sunset, not with dawn, but with fire, with the orange glow of flames licking at wood and thatch and the world outside. And Tam was already up, already moving, already pulling. Ran toward the door with hands that were steady but fast, hands that said, now, 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 without needing to say it. And Rand went, because when Tam's hands moved like that, you went. You did not ask, you did not look. Back, you went. And outside, the world was full of Trollocs. I wish I could tell you that the memory of them softened with time, that Rand looked back on it years later and found that the terror had dulled, had become manageable, had been filed away in the part of the mind where you keep the things that happen to someone else. But I cannot tell you that, because it didn't soften, because they were real, because they were there, those twisted, snarling, wrong-shaped things out of the old. Stories, the ones that were supposed to be myths, the ones that mothers used to frighten children into eating their supper, and they were in Emond's field, in the snow, in the firelight, with axes and torches and eyes. That caught the glow like the eyes of animals. And they were killing, they were burning, they were doing the thing that stories are supposed to warn you about, but never actually show you. And Rand saw it, saw all of it. Saw the barn burning, and the neighbors running, and the things that were running after them, and something in him, some small, quiet, ordinary part of him that had believed the world was safe, that had believed the hills were enough, that had believed the sheep and the seasons and the long golden afternoons would go on forever. That part of him died in the snow that night, and he did not get it back. He never got it back. No one, ever, gets that part back once it's gone. And Tam fell. Not dramatically, not heroically, not with a speech or a final stand, just a stumble, a cry, a hand going to his side where something had cut him, and he went down in the snow, and the snow around him went red. And Rand was there, was on his knees, was pressing his hands against the wound, was saying, Tam, 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 stay with me, don't you dare, over and over like a prayer, like a spell, like if he said it enough times the universe would listen and the blood would stop, and the man who was his father, his whole world, his foundation, his bedrock, would not die in the snow with Trollocs howling 20 yards away. And Tam did not die, not then. But he went under, went pale, went silent, and in the silence, in the delirium, in the fever mutter of a man bleeding out in a ditch while his son tried to keep him warm, Tam said things that were not for Rand. Things that were for a woman named Kari, for a mountain that was not the two rivers, for a child that was not his child, for a truth that had been buried for 17 years under silence and pipe smoke and the steady, solid, unshakable presence of a man who had decided that love was stronger than blood and had built a life on that decision. And Rand heard it, heard all of it, heard the words that cracked the bedrock, heard, not mine. She was not mine. I found him. I took him. He is not my blood. And the world, which had already ended once that night in fire and screaming, ended again. Quieter this time, internal. A sound like ice cracking on a lake. A sound like something settling into a new and permanent wrongness. And then, in the snow, in the dark, with Tam unconscious and the Trollocs still out there and the world still burning and the foundation of his entire identity crumbling beneath him like wet sand, Rand felt it. The thing he had always pretended wasn't there. The thing in the river that pressed against the banks. The thing that was larger than the shape of his life. It moved. Not because he wanted it to move. Not because he reached for it or called it or invited it. It moved because he was terrified, because he was desperate, because his father was dying and the world was ending, and he needed with every cell in his body for something to be different, for something to push back against the dark, and it answered. Not gently, not softly, not in a way he could control or understand or name. It surged, like a dam breaking, like a river finding its channel after years of being dammed up. And the air around him changed, and the snow around him melted, and he felt something flow through him that was not his. That had never been his. That was vast and ancient and alive and hungry, and it poured out of him in a way that he could not stop, could not direct, could not even look at directly, the way you cannot look at the sun. And when it was over, when it finally stopped, when the surge receded and left him gasping and shaking and empty, the Trollocs were gone, driven back, burned away, and Tam was breathing, and Rand was on his knees in the melted snow with his hands still pressed against his father's wound and his mind screaming a single word over and over, a word he did not have the context to understand, a word that meant nothing to him and everything, to the universe, a word that was a death sentence and a coronation and a chain all at once. Channeling. He was channeling. He was touching Saidin. He was doing the thing that drove men mad. The thing that had broken the world 3,000 years ago. The thing that every story, every warning, every whispered caution had told him was the worst fate a man could suffer. And he had done it. Not on purpose, not by choice, but because the world had demanded it. Because the pattern had reached down and used him, the way a hand uses a tool, without asking the tool whether it wanted to be used. And now it was in him. Now it was part of him. Now he could feel it at the edges of his awareness, like a second heartbeat, like a second breath, like a door that had been opened and could not be closed. And the madman's taint was in it, was always in it, would always be in it. The slow, creeping rot that would eat his mind over years, over months, over however long the pattern decided to keep him useful before discarding him. And he did not know any of that yet. Not the full weight of it, not the years that were coming, not the voice that would start whispering in the back of his skull. Not the choices that would have to be made, the terrible, impossible, no good options choices. Not the mountain, and the fire, and the silence after the storm. He didn't know any of it. He was 17. He was in the snow. His father was bleeding. His identity was a lie. And something vast and ancient and indifferent had just marked him as its own. And the forge was lit, and the hammer was raised. And the first blow had fallen. And the boy on the hill, the shepherd, the nobody, the one who just wanted to watch the sheep and grow old in a village that didn't have a name worth remembering, was gone. He was gone, and he was not coming back. And the thing that was coming back in his place, the thing that the pattern was hammering into shape, blow by blow, year by year, scar by scar, was going to be so much larger than him, so much heavier than him, so much more than him, that by the time it was finished, by the time the shape was set and the iron had cooled, no one would remember there had ever been a boy on a hill with a crook in his hand. No one except him. And even he was starting to forget. The road out of the two rivers was not a road in any meaningful sense. It was a tearing, a ripping away, the sensation of being pulled from a warm bed into freezing water, and Rand warped it with Tam's blood still drying on his hands, and the taste of smoke in his throat, and the sound of the village burning still echoing in his ears like a bell that had been struck and would not stop ringing, and Moraine was ahead of them, on her white horse, calm and certain and absolutely immovable in the way of a woman who had decided the shape of the world and intended the world to conform to it. And she said things. She said, "You are Ta'veren, you are the dragon. Reborn, the pattern has chosen you, and the pattern does not make mistakes, and you will come with me now, because the alternative is that you stay here, and the next wave of Trollocs will not miss, and your father will die. And you will die, and the world will end in darkness, because the one person who could have stopped it chose to stay in a burning village and be a shepherd." And Rand heard every word, heard all of it, and he wanted to say, no. Wanted to say, I am not that person. I am not the dragon. I am a shepherd. I watch sheep. I mend fences. I am 17 and I smell like lanolin and I want to go home. But the words would not come because the words were not true anymore. Because the snow was melted around him in a perfect circle where his power had surged, because Tam was bleeding and unconscious and being loaded onto a horse by Perrin's steady hands, because the world had changed shape overnight, and the shape it had taken did not include a boy on a hill with a crook, and so he walked, and he did not look back, and the two rivers shrank behind him like a wound closing, and he did not look back, because if he looked back he would go back, and if he went back he would die, and if he died the world would end, and he did not want the world to end, not even for the sake of going home. And on the road, in the long grey days of walking and hiding and sleeping in ditches and waking to the sound of distant horns, the thing in him moved again. Not dramatically, not in a surge like the night of the Trollocs, but in small ways, in ways that were almost worse because they were quiet, because they crept, because they suggested rather than demanded. He would be walking and feel the air change around him, feel it thicken, feel it become aware, and he would know, without knowing how he knew, that he could reach out and touch it, could pull it toward him, could let it fill him again the way it had filled him in the snow, and the wanting was there, the terrible wanting, because the power was warm and vast and alive, and it made him feel like he was larger than his body, like he was the sky and the earth and everything between, and the wanting frightened him more than the Trollocs, more than the Myrddraal, more than the dark shapes that moved at the edges of the firelight, because the Trollocs were. Outside him were things he could run from, but the power was inside, was part of him now, was woven into the architecture of his being in a way that could not be unwoven, and it was tainted, it was poisoned, and he could feel the poison, could feel it like a thin film of oil on water, could feel it sliding over everything the power touched, and he knew, because Moiraine told him, because the histories told him, because every child in every nation knew the story, that Saidin was cursed, that the male half of the one power had been fouled by the Dark One at the moment of the breaking, that every man who touched it would go mad, slowly, inevitably, over years or months or decades depending on how much he used it, and the madness was not a sudden thing, not a cliff you walked off, but a slope, a gentle, almost imperceptible slope that you walked down for so long, that by the time you realized you were falling, you were already at the bottom, and the fall was over, and the darkness was here, and had always been here, and you could not remember what light looked like. And Rand felt the slope beneath his feet, felt it in the way his thoughts sometimes slipped, in the way colors seemed brighter than they should be, or sounds seemed to come from the wrong direction, in the way he would look at a tree and for a moment, just a moment, not be sure it was a tree and not something else, something watching, something waiting, something that had been there before the world was made and would be there after the world was unmade, and he would blink, and it would be a tree again, and he would walk on, and he would not tell anyone, because telling someone meant admitting it was happening, and admitting it was happening meant accepting that it would get worse, that the slope would steepen, that the bottom was not a place but a person who was not him, a person who had been dead for 3,000 years and was not dead, who was waiting in the space behind his thoughts like a man waiting behind a door, patient, quiet, listening. But that was later. That voice, that presence, that terrible intimacy with a dead man's madness, that was later. For now there was only the road, and the fear, and the slow dawning understanding that he was not going home, that home was gone, that the boy who had stood on the hill with the sheep was a stranger now, someone he used to be someone. He was shedding like a skin, and the thing underneath was not formed yet, was still raw and red and screaming, but it was there, growing, taking shape, being hammered into something by a pattern that did not care about his screaming, and the hammer blows came one after another, each one a new loss, a new impossibility, a new door closing behind him, with a sound like a lock turning in a cell. Tear came after months of road, after the flight and the fighting and the slow grinding exhaustion of being hunted by things that did not tire and did not stop and did not care that he was 17 and frightened and just wanted someone to tell him it would be all right. Tear, the City of the Stone, the fortress that had never fallen in the history of the world, the place where the prophecies said the dragon would come and where the sword waited, had always waited, had been waiting since. The breaking for the hand that would take it up. And Rand walked into the Stone of Tyr. Not as a conqueror, not as a hero, not as the triumphant figure the songs would later paint him as, but as a boy who was tired, who was sick, who was afraid, who had not slept properly in weeks because every time he closed his eyes the power hummed in his skull, and the slope tilted and the thing behind the door shifted and whispered and pressed, and... He walked into the heart of the stone because Moiraine said he had to, because the prophecies said he had to, because the patterns said he had to, because every force in the universe was pointing at him and saying, "This is where you go, this is what you do, this is the next blow on the anvil, and you will stand still and take it, because that is what you are for." And the sword was there, Callandor. The crystal blade, the sangreal, the thing that was not a weapon but a key to enough of the one power to crack the world open like an egg, and it hung in the air in the heart of the stone, suspended, waiting, glowing with a light that was not light, a light that was the idea of light, the memory of light, the promise of light, and it was beautiful, and it was terrible, and Rand looked at it and felt the same thing he had felt on the hill above Emond's field when he looked at the horizon and thought, there is something past this. Except now, the something was not past, was not far away, was not a feeling or a suspicion or a wordless ache. It was right there, 10 feet in front of him, hanging in the air, patient, eternal, waiting for him to reach out and take it, and become the thing he had been running from since the snow. And he did not want to. Gods, he did not want to. He wanted to turn around and walk out of the stone, and walk back to the 2 rivers, and pick up his crook, and watch the sheep, and pretend none of this had happened, pretend the Trollocs were a dream, pretend Tam was not healing from a wound that should have killed him, pretend the power was not in his blood, pretend the slope was not beneath his feet, pretend he was still just a boy, just a shepherd, just a nobody in a village. That didn't matter. But the boy was gone, the shepherd was gone, the nobody was gone. They had been gone since the snow, since the fire, since the circle of melted ground and the first surge of Saidin through his veins, and what was left, what stood in the heart of the stone looking at Callandor, was something else. Something that was still Rand, still had Rand's face and Rand's memories and Rand's stubborn, crooked smile, but was also something more, something larger, something that the pattern had been shaping. Since before he was born, since before Tam had found him on the slopes of Dragonmount, since before Carrie had carried him down from the mountain where the old blood and the new blood had met in a storm of lightning and prophecy. And this thing, this almost. Rand, this Rand in becoming, looked at the sword and understood that reaching for it was not a choice, had never been a choice, that the choice had been made 3,000 years ago by a madman dying on a mountain. And that he was just the echo, just the repetition, just the pattern, turning and coming back to the same point, the same hand, the same sword, the same terrible, inevitable moment. And he reached, and the crystal touched his fingers, and the world went white, not metaphorically, not poetically, literally, physically, absolutely white, a white so total and so complete that it erased everything. Erased the stone, erased Tyr, erased the sky and the earth and the memory of color. And in the white there was the power, Saidin, vast and singing and alive. And it poured into him like a river pouring into the sea, like a sun pouring into a single human eye. And it was too much, it was always too much, it was more than any man was built to hold. And he felt himself stretching, felt himself thinning, felt the edges of his identity beginning to dissolve like sugar in hot water, felt the boy on the hill, the shepherd, the nobody, the one who smelled like lanolin and watched sheep and wanted nothing more than a quiet life, felt that boy dissolving, going, and in his place something else was forming, something harder, something colder, something with the weight of the world already settling onto its shoulders, and the white lasted a moment or an eternity. He could not tell which, and when it faded, when the world came back, when the stone and the city and the sky reassembled, themselves around him. He was standing in the heart of the stone with Callandor in his hand, and he was the dragon reborn, and the prophecies were fulfilled, and the world was watching, and the boy on the hill was dead. Not gone, not erased. Dead. There is a difference, and the difference matters, because gone means you might come back, erased means you might be recovered. But dead means the shape is set, the iron is cooling, the hammer has fallen, and the blow has landed, and the thing that was before is not the thing that is now, and never will be again. And Rand stood in the white silence of the heart of the stone, and felt the absence of himself, felt the space where the shepherd had been. And the space was empty, and the emptiness ached, and he would carry that ache for the rest of his life, through every battle, and every throne, and every terrible choice, and every night spent staring at the ceiling. Listening to the voice behind the door, he would carry the ache of the boy he had been, the boy who had wanted nothing, who had needed nothing, who had been enough just as he was, and who would never be enough. Again, because the pattern had decided that enough was not what it needed, that enough was not what the world required, that the world required everything, and everything was what he would give, and everything was what it would cost. And the forge burned, and the hammer fell. And the second blow rang out across the stone of Tyr, across the city, across the world, and every nation heard it, every prophecy recorded it, every soul alive felt the tremor of it in their bones, and the iron took another shape, and the shape was sharper now, harder, more defined, and the boy was gone from it, and the shepherd was gone from it, and what remained was the beginning of the sword, the beginning of the dragon, the beginning of the thing that would save the world and break itself, doing it. And Randall Thor, the dragon reborn, walked out of the heart of the stone with a crystal sword in his hand, and the whole world watching. And he did not smile, and he did not raise the blade in triumph, and he did not make a speech, because there was nothing to say, nothing to celebrate, nothing to triumph over, because the victory was not his, the choice was not his. The sword had chosen him the way a disease chooses a body, the way a fire chooses a forest, the way the pattern chooses the threads it needs and does not ask them whether they want to be woven, and all he could do was walk and carry the weight and listen to the silence where the shepherd used to be, and wonder in the quiet hours, in the dark hours, in the hours when the world was not watching and the prophecies were not demanding and the pattern was not reaching, whether the boy on the hill was still in there somewhere, still watching the sheep, still smelling like lanolin, still believing that the world was small and safe and manageable. He was not. And Rand knew it, and he walked on. The dragon reborn had a sword and a prophecy, and the weight of the world settling onto his shoulders like snow accumulating on a roof that was never built to carry it. And what he did not have, what the prophecies and the Aes Sedai and the pattern had neglected to provide, was any instruction whatsoever on what a dragon reborn was actually supposed to do with all of it, because Callandor in his hand was a key to power beyond measure, and the prophecies in the hands of every nation were a map of where he was supposed to end up. But between the sword and the ending, between the boy on the hill and the last battle, there was a vast and terrible expanse of politics and armies and nations that did not want to be saved, and peoples who would sooner die than kneel to a man from a village they had never heard of. And Rand stood at the beginning of that expanse with no army, no allies, no understanding of how the world worked beyond the borders of the two rivers, and the only tool he had was the truth, which was the worst tool imaginable, because the truth was ugly and the truth was complicated, and the truth required him to walk into places that wanted him dead and say, "I am what the prophecies say I am, and you will follow me, not because I am stronger than you, but because the alternative is extinction and hope." That hope was enough to make them listen before they killed him. It was not enough, not at first see, not by itself. And so Rand went to the Aiel Waste, went to Rhuidean, went to the city that the Aiel feared more than death, because the Aiel Fin had told him he must go, because the pattern required it, because there was something in that city that he needed, something that would give him not an army but a people, not a weapon but a story. And the story was this: the Aiel, those fierce, proud, desert-born warriors who had spent 3,000 years believing themselves the chosen people of the Creator, the people who could not kill, The people who had warped out of the breaking with a code of honor so rigid it defined every breath they took, were not what they believed themselves to be, were not warriors by nature, were not chosen by the Creator for any particular purpose. They were followers, they were servants, they were the descendants of the Destined Aiel who had served. Lews, Therin Telamon 3,000 years ago, who had carried the seed of the world through the breaking, who had been told to become warriors by the very man whose madness had broken the world. And that truth, that terrible, foundational, identity-shattering truth, was what Rand carried out of Rhuidean in his hands like a blade wrapped in silk, and he held it up before the assembled clans of the Aiel, and he said, "This is what you are. This is where you come from. This is the lie you have built your entire civilization upon, and I am sorry, and I know that this hurts, and I know that some of you will want to kill me for saying it, but the truth is, the only foundation on which we can build what comes next, because what comes next requires all of you, all of the Aiel, united under one banner, walking not toward war, but toward the last battle, the battle that will decide whether the world continues to exist." And the Aiel looked at him, and some of them wept, and some of them reached for spears, and some of them knelt, and the kneeling was not victory, was not triumph, was not the clean, simple thing that Psalms would later make it, because the kneeling was built on the grief of a people discovering that their identity was a construct, that their pride was a cage, that their whole history was a wound inflicted by a madman 3,000 years dead. And Rand had reopened that wound, had torn the scab off and said, look at this. This is what you are. This is what was done to you, and I cannot undo it. But I can give you a new purpose, a new shape, a reason to carry the spear that is not vengeance but survival." And they knelt, and they called him Kara Khan, Chief of Chiefs, and the weight on his shoulders grew heavier, because now he had a people, now he had 100,000 warriors who looked to him for direction, and every life he spent, every order he gave, every battle he sent them into, was a debt he would carry forever, a debt written in blood on the inside of his skull, where no one could see it, but where it pressed against him every night when he tried to sleep. And this was the beginning of the change, the beginning of the hardening, because before Rhuidean, before the Aiel, before the crown of thorns that was leadership, Rand had been afraid, had been uncertain, had been a boy, reacting to the world, flinching from it, trying to dodge the blows. But after Rhuidean, after 100,000 men knelt in the dust and called him chief, and looked at him with those expectant, desperate, needing eyes, something shifted in him, something calcified, because you cannot flinch when 100,000 people are watching. You cannot hesitate when the fate of a nation rests on the next word out of your mouth. You cannot be afraid when fear is a luxury that belongs to people who are not responsible for other lives. And Rand stopped being afraid, or rather, he stopped allowing himself to be afraid, which is not the same thing, which is worse. Because the fear was still there, still pressing, still alive in the space behind his ribs. But he built a wall around it, a wall made of duty and necessity and the cold arithmetic of command, and behind the wall, the boy crouched and trembled and watched the sheep in his memory, and in front of the wall the dragon stood and made decisions and did not look back. Lan Mandragoran taught him the sword, or rather, Lan Mandragoran taught him what the sword meant, because the physical technique was secondary, was almost irrelevant, was the smallest part of the lesson, and the real lesson was philosophical, was ethical, was a way of being in the world that had nothing to do with killing and everything to do with choosing. And Lan said, the sword is not for killing, the sword is for deciding when not to kill. The sword is the last resort and the first responsibility and the thing you carry so that you never have to use it. And if you use it, you have already failed in some measure, because the true swordsman is one who stands in the path of violence and does not move, who makes the other man understand that this is the line, that beyond this line is death, and the other man stops and no one dies, and that is the victory. And Rand learned this, learned it in his body, in his hands, in the way he held himself and moved through a room. Learned that power was not the absence of restraint, but the presence of it, that the strongest man in the room was not the one who could kill everyone, but the one who could and chose not to. And this lesson sat alongside the other lesson, the lesson of the Aiel, the lesson of Rhuidean, The lesson that truth was a weapon and that leadership was a wound, and that every crown was made of thorns and the wearing of it was the price of the wearing, and together these lessons built the shape of what Rand was becoming, the shape of the man who would walk into Gai'don and Tyr and the great nations of the world, and remake them, not with fire, not with force, but with the terrible, patient, inexorable pressure of a man who knew what was coming and would not be stopped by anything less than the end of the world. And Gai'don was the test, the first real test, the place where the shepherd's instincts died completely and the politician was born, because Gai'don was a game, a vast and ancient and infinitely complicated game of houses and alliances and betrayals and counter-betrayals, a game that had been played for centuries by people who considered manipulation an art form and honesty a weakness, and Rand walked into it not as a player, but as a piece. As the piece that everyone wanted to control, the dragon reborn, the prize, the weapon, the tool. And he looked at the game, looked at the players, looked at the smiles that hid knives and the hands that offered friendship while reaching for your throat. And he understood in the cold, clear way that the power gave him, that he could not play their game, that he could not become them, that the only way to survive, Gai'don, was to change the rules, to be the thing they did not expect, to be honest in a city of liars, to be direct in a city of whispers, to walk into the room and say, I am the dragon reborn, I will not play your games, I will not take sides in your little wars. I will take the throne because the prophecies require it, and because the world needs a unified front against the shadow, and if you do not like it, you may leave, but you may not stay and undermine me, you may not stay and whisper and plot and scheme, because I do not have time for your games. I have the end of the world to prevent, and every hour I spend navigating your politics is an hour the shadow gains, and I will not spend it, I will not. And they stared at him, and they hated him for it, and they feared him for it, and they followed him for it, because in a city of liars the most terrifying thing you can be is the one man who tells the truth. And Rand told the truth, blunt and heavy and absolute, and the truth cut through the game like Callandor cutting through the air, and Gai'don knelt, and Tyr held. And the nations began to look at the dragon reborn and see not a boy, not a weapon, not a prophecy with legs, but a leader, a man who could be trusted because he was too honest to deceive, too direct to manipulate, too consumed by the enormity of what was coming to bother with the small cruelties of politics. And the cost of all this, the cost that no one saw, the cost that Rand paid in the dark hours when the mask came off and the wall around, the fear grew thinner and the boy behind it pressed his face against the barrier and whispered, I want to go home, I want to watch the sheep, I want to be small, I want to be no one. The cost was the slow erosion of everything soft in him, everything gentle, everything that had been the shepherd. Because you cannot be soft and lead 100,000 warriors, you cannot be gentle and play the Game of Thrones, you cannot be kind and make the decisions that need making when the alternative is the death of millions. And Rand felt the softness going, felt it leaving like warmth, leaving a body in the cold, slowly, inevitably, and he did not fight it, because fighting it meant being weak, and being weak meant dying. And dying meant the shadow won, and the shadow could not win, not while he stood, not while he breathed, not while the power sang in his blood and the prophecies pointed at him and the pattern demanded he be the thing it needed him to be. And so the iron hardened and the shape sharpened and the edges grew cold and the boy behind the wall grew quieter and the dragon in front of the wall grew louder and the space between them grew wider and the voice behind the door, the voice of Lews Therin, the voice of the man who had done this before 3,000 years ago, who had broken the world and lost his mind and died screaming on a mountain, that voice grew louder too because it recognized the pattern, recognized the shape, recognized the terrible familiar trajectory of a man becoming a weapon and calling it duty and calling it sacrifice and calling it anything except what it was, which was a slow and willing death of the self. And the third blow fell on the anvil, and the shape was clearer now, harder, more defined, and the thorns of the crown were pressing into the skull, and the blood that ran from them was not visible, was not the kind of blood that could be seen or wiped away or healed. It was the blood of the inner world, the blood of the boy who was dying by inches, and Rand carried it, carried all of it, the crown and the sword and the army and the nations and the weight of every life that depended on his next decision. And he walked forward into the dark, into the next battle, into the next impossible choice, into the next night of staring at the ceiling and listening to the voice behind the door and wondering if the man whispering was Lews Therin or if it was him, if the madness was the dead man's or his own, if the coldness was strength or rot, if the hardness was survival or death. He did not know. He could not know. And the not knowing was the worst part. Worse than the battles, worse than the politics, worse than the weight, because at least those things were external, were problems to be solved, were enemies to be fought, but the not knowing was internal, was structural, was the crack in the iron that no amount of hammering could fix, only widen. And Rand felt it widening, felt it spreading, felt the fault line running through him from the crown to the soles of his feet. And he walked on, because walking on was all he had, because stopping meant thinking, and thinking meant feeling, and feeling meant admitting that the boy behind the wall was not just crouching anymore, was not just trembling, was dying, was actually dying, and if Rand admitted that, if he let himself feel the full weight of it, he would break, and he could not break, not yet, not until the last battle was won, not until the shadow was driven back, not until the world was safe. And after that, after all of that, maybe he could afford to break. Maybe he could afford to grieve. Maybe he could afford to sit down and weep for the boy he had been and the man he was becoming and the distance between them. But not now, not yet. Not while the forge was burning and the hammer was falling and the world needed a dragon and did not care that the dragon was a boy in a mask that was fusing to his face, becoming the only face, until there was no boy behind it, no mask, no separation, just the dragon, just the function, just the tool, just the shape the pattern had hammered him into. And the iron rang, and the crown bit deeper, and Rand Thor walked on into the dark, carrying everything, feeling nothing, being everything for everyone, being nothing for himself, and the road ahead was long, and the road ahead was bloody, and the road ahead led to a well in the earth where men would chain him and break him, and he would break back, and the breaking would change him into something that even he would not recognize, something made of steel and silence and the absolute refusal to ever be vulnerable again. But that was the next blow. That was the next chapter. That was the well. And the well was waiting. There are moments in a life when the shape of the soul is tested, when the iron is plunged into the deepest and darkest part of the fire and held there until it glows white hot and begins to scream. And for Rand Thor, that moment did not come on a battlefield surrounded by the glory of war. It came in the back of a wagon, inside a wooden box that was barely large enough to hold a man curled on his side, a box that smelled of sweat and fear, and the slow, creeping realization that the people he had trusted, the people he had tried to protect, the people he had bent over backward to treat with respect and kindness, and the stubborn, foolish hope that decency would be met with decency, had betrayed him, had chained him, had locked him in the dark, and were now taking turns beating him with a switch to teach him a lesson about his place in the world. The box was small, so small that he could not stretch his legs, could not sit up, could not do anything but lie in the filth and listen to the sound of the wagon wheels grinding over the dirt and the sound of the women talking outside, the Aes Sedai, the women who were supposed to be the servants of the world, the guides, the wise ones, the women he had approached with an open hand and a plea for unity, because the last battle was coming and the shadow was rising and they needed to stand together or they would all die in the dark. And they had responded to his open hand by slipping a leash around his neck and dragging him toward the White Tower to be broken, to be tamed, to be made into a weapon they could point at the enemy and pull the trigger without ever having to look the weapon in the eye or acknowledge that the weapon had a heart that was currently being crushed into dust in the back of a wagon. And the whip came down. Not a sword, not a noble weapon, not the clean strike of an enemy on a battlefield, but a switch. A thin and flexible and biting thing that cracked against the wood and found the gaps and laid. lines of fire across his back, across his shoulders, across the flesh that had already been bruised and battered by the journey, and with every strike, with every crack of the wood, and every gasp of pain that he swallowed because he would not give them the satisfaction of hearing him cry out, a piece of the boy from Emond's field died, a piece of the shepherd who believed that if you were good, if you were just, if you did the right thing even when it was hard, the universe would eventually recognize your goodness and reward you with a quiet life and a clear conscience. He tried to hold on. Gods, he tried so hard to hold on. He tried to remember Tam's voice telling him to be good, to be just, to remember that mercy was the mark of a great man and that vengeance was a poison you drank, expecting the other person to die. And he recited those words in the dark, over and over, like a shield, like a prayer, like a spell that would keep the monster at bay. But the monster was not at bay. The monster was in the box with him. The monster was the voice behind the door, the voice of Lews, Therin Telamon, the man who had lived this exact nightmare 3,000 years ago, the man who had trusted the world and been broken by it. And for the first time since the voice had started whispering in the back of his skull, it was not whispering, it was not hiding, it was not a distant echo of a dead man's madness. It was right there, right beside him, in the dark, in the filth, in the pain, and it was laughing. It was a terrible and broken and weeping kind of laughter. The laughter of a man who has finally reached the end of his endurance and found that there is nothing on the other side but the abyss. And Lews Therin laughed. And Rand felt the laughter vibrating in his own chest, felt the madness bleeding across the boundary between them, felt the wall he had built to keep the shepherd safe from the dragon crumbling into dust under the weight of the whip and the betrayal and the absolute undeniable proof that the world did not want a good man. The world did not want a shepherd, the world wanted a monster. And if he was going to save the world, if he was going to drag it, kicking and screaming to the last battle and keep it alive long enough to face the shadow, he had to become the monster they were trying to make him. And then the box broke, and it did not break from the outside. It was not pried open by rescuers, though the rescuers were coming, though Perrin was coming with the Two Rivers men, though the Aiel were coming with their spears and their veils, though Mazrim Taim and the Usherman were coming with the terrible unfiltered power of men who had been taught to embrace the madness and use it as a hammer. No, the box broke from the inside. Because Rand al'Thor stopped holding back, stopped trying to be careful, stopped trying to be gentle with the power, because he was afraid of hurting someone, afraid of losing control, afraid of becoming the thing the prophecies said he would become. And in the dark, with the blood on his back and the boy in his heart finally and mercifully bleeding out, he reached for Saidin, reached for the tainted and raging and infinite river of the male half of the true source. And he did not sip it, he did not channel it, he became it. The wood exploded, not into splinters but into dust. The air around the wagon ignited into a storm of wind and fire, an absolute crushing pressure. And when the dust settled, when the Aes Sedai, who had held the leash, looked up to see what they had unleashed, they did not see a boy, they did not see a prisoner, they did not even see a man. They saw the dragon reborn, they saw the incarnation of a force that had broken the world once, and was perfectly willing to break it again, if it meant making them understand finally and forever that he was not their tool, he was not their plaything, he was not a dog to be beaten and leashed and kept in a box. He stood in the center of the wreckage, and the Ashermen were kneeling, and the Aiel were standing with their spears lowered in reverence, and the Two Rivers men were staring with a mixture of terror and awe, and the Aes Sedai, the proud and immovable and arrogant women who had believed they could tame the storm, were on their knees in the dirt, their shields shattered, their authority reduced to ash. And Rand looked down at them, and there was no anger in his eyes, no rage, no heat, because anger is a human emotion, and the thing looking down at them was no longer trying to be human. There was only a cold and vast and terrifying emptiness, the emptiness of a man who has looked into the abyss and realized that the abyss is afraid of him. And he spoke, and his voice was not loud. It did not need to be loud. It carried across the battlefield like the sound of a glacier moving, slow and inevitable and crushing everything in its path. And he said, "You may kneel to the dragon reborn, or you may die, And it was not a threat, it was not a boast, it was a statement of absolute, unshakable fact, the new law of the world, the line that had been drawn in the blood of the boy who had died in the box, and they knelt, every single one of them, the proud and the broken and the terrified, they knelt in the dirt, and they swore oaths, and Rand watched them do it, and he felt nothing, no triumph, no vindication, no joy. Only the cold and heavy and permanent settling of the steel into his soul, the realization that from this day forward he would never again ask for their respect. He would take it, he would enforce it, he would carve it into the bedrock of the world with fire and fear if he had to, because love had failed, kindness had failed, the open hand had been met with a whip, and the only language the world understood was power. This was the well, the deep dark well of chains where the shepherd went to die, and the dragon was forged in the cold and the dark, and the absolute refusal to ever be vulnerable again. And in the days that followed, in the long march back to Caerhien with the captive Aes Sedai trailing behind his horse like prisoners of war, the change in him was visible to everyone who had known him before, visible in the way he sat in the saddle, rigid and untouchable, visible in the way he looked at people, not with the warm, crooked smile of the boy from the Two Rivers, but with the flat, assessing stare of a general looking at a map and calculating how many lives a particular maneuver would cost, visible in the way he spoke, giving orders that were not suggestions, that were not open for debate, that were the final word of a man who had learned in the box that hesitation was a luxury he could not afford and mercy was a weakness his enemies would exploit until there was nothing left of him but bone and ash. Perrin saw it. Perrin, with his golden eyes and his slow, deep understanding of the world, saw the friend he had grown up with slipping away behind a wall of ice, tried to reach him, tried to talk to him about home, about Tam, about the sheep and the hills and the life that was waiting for them when this was all over, and Rand looked at him and smiled, but the smile did not reach his eyes. The smile was a mask, a polite and distant thing. That said, I remember you, I remember who we were, but that person is dead. He died in a box on the road to the White Tower, and I am what is left. I am the thing that has to carry the sword and face the shadow and make the choices that will keep you alive. And I cannot afford to be your friend right now. I cannot afford to be soft, because if I am soft, the world breaks. And if the world breaks, everyone dies, and I will not let everyone die, not even if it means I have to become a monster to save them. And Min saw it. Min, who could see the auras around people, who could see the shapes of their destinies hovering over their heads like crowns of light and shadow, looked at Rand and saw the darkness growing, saw the steel hardening, saw the terrible, lonely path he was walking, a path that led away from the warmth of human connection and into the cold, high peaks of absolute power. And she wanted to weep for him, wanted to reach out and touch his face and tell him that he did not have to do this alone, that he could lean on her, that he could be weak for just one moment, just 1 hour, just long enough to let the boy come back and breathe. But she knew. She knew with the terrible clarity of someone who loves a man doomed by prophecy that the boy was not coming back, that the box had done its work, that the chains had forged the iron, and that the man standing before her was the dragon reborn in truth, not just in name, a man who had traded his soul for the survival of the world and was now paying the price in the quiet hours of the night when the mask came off and the silence in his tent was so loud it threatened to deafen him. Because the silence was not empty. The silence was full of Lews, Therin, full of the madman who was no longer hiding behind the door, who was now sitting in the front room of his mind, pacing the floor, muttering about betrayal and women and the inevitable end of all things, and Rand had to share his skull with this ghost, had to negotiate with this echo, had to fight for control of his own hands and his own thoughts while planning the logistics of a global war. And the strain of it, the sheer exhausting, impossible strain of holding two minds in one body while holding the fate of the world in one hand, was a weight that no human spine was built to carry. And Rand felt it bending him, felt it pressing him down, felt the cracks forming in the steel, the tiny, invisible fractures that would eventually and inevitably lead to the mountain, to the fire, to the moment. When the weight became too much, and the man who had saved himself from the box decided that the only way to save the world was to destroy it and start over. But that was later. That was the mountain, that was the madness, and for now there was only the well, only the cold, hard aftermath of Dumai's wells, only the long, slow realization that the boy on the hill was truly gone, that the shepherd was a memory, that the crown of thorns had been replaced by a crown of steel, and that Rand or Thor, the dragon reborn, the savior of the world, the breaker of chains and the forger of empires, was now the most dangerous man alive. Not because of the power he wielded, not because of the armies he commanded, but because he had looked into the heart of his own compassion, found it wanting, and chosen to replace it with the cold and terrible and absolute will to win, no matter the cost, no matter the blood, no matter how many pieces of his own soul he had to carve away and leave behind in the dark. The forge was still burning, the hammer was still falling, and the shape of the sword was almost complete, sharp and cold and utterly devoid of the warmth that had once defined the iron. And Rand rode forward into the gathering storm, his face a mask of stone, his eyes fixed on the horizon, his mind a battlefield where the shepherd wept and the madman laughed and the dragon planned the end of the world, carrying the weight of everything, feeling nothing, being everything for everyone, being nothing for himself, walking the long, bloody road toward the mountain where the final blow would fall, where the steel would either shatter or become something the world had never seen before. The voice did not arrive all at once, did not announce itself with fanfare or drama or the kind of clear and present danger that a man could recognize and prepare for. It came the way all terrible things come, slowly, quietly, so gradually that by the time you realize it is there, it has already been there for so long that you cannot remember when it started, cannot remember a time when it was not part of the architecture of your mind. And for Rand or Thor, the voice was Lews, Therin, Tel'aran'rhiod, the man who had been the dragon before him, the man who had broken the world 3,000 years ago and gone mad on the slopes of Dragonmount and killed everyone he had ever loved before the pattern, finally and mercifully stopped his heart. And that voice was in Rand's skull now, was woven into the fabric of his thoughts, the way the Taint was woven into Saidin, inseparable, inescapable. A constant companion in the long dark hours when sleep would not come and the world was quiet, and the only sound was the whisper of a dead man who had done this before and was trying to tell him how it would end. At first the voice was distant, was a murmur at the edges of consciousness, was the kind of thing you could mistake for your own thoughts if you were not paying attention, if you were tired enough or stressed enough or desperate enough to let the boundary between yourself and the ghost blur. And Rand told himself it was just that, just stress, just exhaustion, just the natural consequence of carrying the weight of the world and channeling a power that was slowly and inevitably eating his mind, and he tried to ignore it, tried to push it down, tried to build walls around it the way he had built walls around the fear and the shepherd and the boy, who wanted to watch sheep, but the walls did not work, not with Lews Therin, because Lews Therin was not an external thing, was not an enemy that could be fought, or a problem that could be solved. Lews Therin was him, was the shape he would take if he failed, was the future that was waiting for him at the end of the road, and you cannot build a wall against your own future. You can only walk toward it and hope that when you arrive, you are strong enough to face it. The voice grew louder as the months passed, as the battles multiplied, as the weight on his shoulders became so immense that he could feel it pressing him down into the earth, and the voice was not kind, was not helpful, was not the wise counsel of an ancestor guiding a descendant through the darkness. The voice was broken, was mad, was the voice of a man who had lost everything and was screaming into the void and expecting the void to answer and lose. Therein talked about women, talked about Ileana, talked about the woman he had loved and killed with his own hands when the madness took him, talked about her face and her laugh and the way she had looked at him before the end. And Rand listened, could not stop listening, because the voice was inside him, was part of him, and every word Lews Therin spoke was a word that Rand was speaking to himself, was a thought that Rand was thinking, and the boundary between them was dissolving like sugar in water, like ink in rain, and Rand could not tell where he ended, and Lews Therin began, could not tell if the rage he felt was his own or the dead man's, if the paranoia was his or the ghost's, If the suspicion that everyone was against him, that every woman was trying to control him, that every friend was a traitor waiting for the right moment to strike, if all of that was Rand or Lews, Therin, or some terrible fusion of both, a new thing that was neither man but something worse, something that had the power of a god and the broken mind of a madman and the absolute certainty that the world was against him, and the only way to survive was to strike first. And he struck. Gods, how he struck. The cleansing of Saidin was the miracle, was the thing that the histories would sing about, was the moment when Thor did the impossible, when he reached into the heart of the world's oldest wound and healed it, when he stood in the ruins of Shadar Logoth with Nynaeve Omera at his side, and the two of them, a man and a woman, channeling together in a way that had not been done since the breaking, reached into the taint that had poisoned the male half of the one power for 3,000 years and pulled it out, burned it away, cleansed it with a combination of Saidin and Sadar that was so vast and so terrible that the sky itself seemed to scream. And when it was done, when the taint was gone, when the madness was no longer inevitable, when the men who could channel could do so without the slow creeping rot eating their minds, Rand stood in the ruins and felt nothing. Felt no triumph, no joy, no relief, only the cold and heavy and permanent exhaustion of a man who has done the thing that was required and knows that the doing of it has cost him something he cannot name and will never get back. Because the cleansing was not just a miracle, was not just a victory, was also a confession. Was Rand standing in front of the world and saying, I am still here, I am still sane, I am still me, I have not gone mad yet, I am still the man who can save you. Do not abandon me, do not leave me, do not look at me with that pity in your eyes, do not treat me like I am already gone. And the confession was necessary, was the only way to prove to the Aes Sedai and the nations and the pattern itself that he was still functional, still useful, still the dragon reborn, and not just another madman screaming on a mountain. But the cost of the confession was the final and complete hardening of the steel, was the last piece of the shepherd dying, was the realization that he could not afford to be vulnerable, could not afford to be weak, could not afford to let anyone see the cracks in the armor. Because if they saw the cracks, they would try to help him. And if they tried to help him, they would get close to him. And if they got close to him, they could be used against him. And he could not allow that. Could not allow anyone he cared about to be a weapon in someone else's hand. And so he pushed them away. Pushed everyone away. Pushed Min and Avienda and Elaine and Perrin and Matt and every single person who had ever looked at him with something other than fear or duty. Pushed them away with cold words and harsh decisions, and the absolute refusal to let anyone get close enough to see the boy crouching behind the wall of steel, crouching and trembling and whispering, I want to go home, I want to watch the sheep, I want to be small, I want to be no one. The voice laughed. Lews. Therin laughed. Laughed at the irony, laughed at the tragedy, laughed at the man who was doing exactly what he had done 3,000 years ago, who was pushing everyone away because he was afraid of losing them. Who was becoming a monster to save the world, who was trading his soul for victory and calling it duty and calling it sacrifice and calling it anything except what it was, which was a slow and willing death of the self. And Rand heard the laughter and wanted to scream, wanted to reach into his own skull and tear the voice out, wanted to find the ghost and strangle it with his bare hands, but he could not, because the ghost was him, because the voice was his own voice, because the madness was not Lews Therin's madness, but his own, was the madness that came from carrying too much for too long, from being hammered into a shape he never chose, from being forced to be everything for everyone and nothing for himself. And the laughter was the sound of the iron finally and irrevocably cracking, the sound of the fault line running through him, from the crown to the soles. His feet finally giving way, the sound of the man who had saved the world, realizing that he could not save himself. And the loneliness was absolute, was a thing so vast and so total that it had its own gravity, its own weight, its own physical presence in the room with him, and Rand sat in his tent in the dark hours and stared at the ceiling, and listened to the voice, and felt the loneliness pressing him down into the earth, felt it filling the spaces where the shepherd used to be, where the boy used to crouch, where the warmth used to live, and he could not reach out, could not call for help, could not let anyone see the cracks. because if he let anyone see the cracks, they would try to fix him. And he could not be fixed. Not now, not until the last battle was won. Not until the shadow was driven back. Not until the world was safe. And after that, after all of that, maybe he could afford to break. Maybe he could afford to grieve. Maybe he could afford to sit down and weep for the boy he had been, and the man he was becoming, and the distance between them. But not now, not yet, not while the forge was still burning and the hammer was still falling, and the world needed a dragon and did not care that. The dragon was a boy in a mask that was fusing to his face. And the voice whispered about the mountain, about the end, about the terrible, inevitable trajectory of a man who carries too much for too long, whispered that he would go mad, that he would break, that he would do what Therin had done, would kill everyone he loved and then kill himself. And Rand listened, and he did not argue, did not fight, did not try to push the voice away, because the voice was right. Because the trajectory was real, because the madness was not a possibility, but an inevitability, was the destination that the road had been leading to since the first night in the snow, since the first surge of Saidin through his veins, since the first blow of the hammer on the anvil. And he could not stop it, could not change it, could only walk toward it and hope that when he arrived, he would be strong enough to face it, strong enough to do what needed to be done, strong enough to save the world, even if it meant destroying himself in the process. And the forge burned, and the hammer fell, and the voice whispered, and Randall Thor walked on into the dark, carrying everything, feeling nothing, being everything for everyone, being nothing for himself, walking the long, bloody road toward the mountain where the final blow would fall, where the steel would either shatter or become something the world had never seen before. But the mountain was coming. The mountain was always coming. And when it arrived, when the weight became too much, and the man who had saved himself from the box decided that the only way to save the world was to destroy it and start over, when the madness finally and irrevocably took hold and the dragon Reborn stood on the peak of Dragon Mount with the power to unmake everything in his hands and the absolute certainty that unmaking was the only way forward. When that moment came, when the voice in his skull became the only voice, when Therin became Rand, and Rand became Therin, and the two of them became something new, something terrible, something that had the power of a god and the broken mind of a madman. When that moment came, the world would hold its breath and wait to see if the iron would shatter or if it would become something else, something that had never been forged before, something that was not a sword, but a light, not a weapon, but a gift, not a dragon, but a man. But that was the mountain. That was the madness. That was the next chapter. And the mountain was waiting.